You didn't arrive here by coincidence. Something in you, quiet, ancient, and stubbornly alive, pulled you to this moment. Not the part of you that scrolls for distraction, but the deeper self that can feel a shift before it has a name. Because lately, maybe life has looked normal. Same streets, same sky, same routines, but you don't feel the same inside them. It's like you walk through an invisible door, and only now you're noticing the air is different. The things that used to hook you don't hook you as easily. The fears that used to run your decisions don't have the same grip. And the old ways you survived, people-pleasing, overthinking, chasing certainty, start to feel strangely exhausting. Here's what Jung understood. The psyche doesn't always change with fireworks. It changes with subtle rewiring, with a quiet inner no where there used to be panic, with a pause where there used to be a reaction. No one announces your growth. There's no ceremony. There are just small moments where you realize something that used to control you can't reach you the same way anymore. And that's why this matters. Because the hardest test of your soul isn't the storm. It's who you become after the storm has passed, when no one is watching, when life doesn't feel dramatic, but your inner world has permanently shifted. So today, I'm going to walk with you through 7 unmistakable signs you've already crossed the most painful threshold and entered a deeper stage of maturity, one you may not have even named yet. If even a few of these land in your chest, let it be proof you've come farther than you think. Sign number 1. You're no longer afraid of solitude. The fear isn't being alone, it's being alone with yourself. Because solitude doesn't just take away people, it takes away your roles. It takes away the noise you've been using to avoid a very specific moment, the moment your inner voice gets loud enough to be heard. For a long stretch of life, most of us don't actually fear silence. We fear what silence reveals. We fear sitting in a room where nothing is happening, because then we have to face the one person we can't escape, us. So we stay busy. We keep the TV on even when we're not watching it. We scroll like it's a reflex. We fill the calendar, not because we're fulfilled, but because empty space feels dangerous. And if we're honest, a lot of that isn't social. It's anesthesia. Because when the noise finally fades, a question rises up like a tide. Who am I when no one is looking? Jung understood this fear better than most. He knew that solitude is a mirror. And for people who have spent years living outward, chasing approval, adapting to expectations, managing other people's reactions, that mirror can feel unbearable. Not because you're weak, but because you've been living at a distance from yourself. But here's the first sign you've passed the hardest test of your soul. Solitude stops feeling like punishment, and it starts feeling like relief. Not the relief of no one wants me, the relief of I finally get to breathe. You begin to notice it in small, ordinary moments that don't look spiritual from the outside. A morning where you wake up and you don't reach for your phone right away. You sit on the edge of the bed for a minute. You feel your breath. You feel your body. You let the day arrive without being grabbed by it. An evening where you choose to stay home. Not because you weren't invited, not because you're depressed, but because you genuinely want your own company. You make something simple to eat. You take a shower slowly. You sit in the quiet, and for once, you don't try to fill it. Or you go for a walk alone and you don't feel that familiar ache of, I should be doing more, or I should be with someone. You just walk. You look at the trees, you notice the sky. Your mind isn't racing for stimulation. Your body isn't scanning for validation. And something inside you says, this is safe. That's not a small shift. That is massive. Because when solitude becomes safe, it means you're no longer at war with yourself. It means the energy that used to pour outward trying to be seen, trying to be chosen, trying to be approved of, has started to come back home. And this is where Jung's insight cuts deep. He said loneliness doesn't come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that feel important to you. In other words, the most painful loneliness isn't being alone, it's being unseen, even when you're surrounded. So when you start enjoying solitude, it often means you've begun communicating with yourself again. You've begun hearing what you actually feel and not what you should feel. You're no longer drowning your inner world in constant input. You can feel sadness without immediately reaching for distraction. You can sit with discomfort long enough for it to tell you what it came to say. That's a soul that has grown, and it usually happens after you've been through something that stripped you down, a heartbreak, a loss, a collapse of an identity, something that forced you to stop living on autopilot. And on the other side of that storm, you find this quiet truth. The silence is no longer against me, it's with me. It's the ground where your nervous system finally rests after years of adapting, pleasing, proving, performing. It's where you start to recognize yourself without all the filters. And once you have that, your relationships change because you stop entering them from hunger. You stop clinging. You meet people from fullness, not lack. You connect because you want to share, not because you need to be saved. So if you've noticed solitude changing, if it's starting to feel like a sanctuary instead of a sentence, let that be your sign. You're not isolating, you're grounding. And when solitude stops feeling like punishment, something deeper begins to shift. Because the next sign is where you stop seeing life through the eyes of a wounded ego and you start seeing with awareness. Sign number 2, you stop blaming others. You don't force forgiveness, you simply start seeing more. And that's one of the most shocking signs you've passed a major inner threshold because the old you needed someone to be at fault. The wounded ego almost always does, not because it's evil, but because blame gives pain a shape. It gives suffering a place to land. It answers the desperate question that comes with hurt. Who did this to me? For a long time, that question feels necessary. When you're bleeding emotionally, your mind reaches for a culprit the way a drowning person reaches for anything solid. If you can name the villain, you can make sense of the chaos. If you can assign guilt, you can feel less powerless. But then something changes, not overnight, not with fireworks, more like a quiet shift in the way your mind holds reality. The question matures. It turns from who hurt me into what is this revealing in me? And at first, that can sound insulting, like you're excusing people who treated you badly. That's not what this is. Jung was very clear. Seeing symbolically doesn't mean pretending harm didn't happen. It means you stop letting your healing depend on someone else becoming different. You stop waiting for the world to finally behave so you can finally be okay. Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. And that line is uncomfortable because it points to a truth most people avoid. Your strongest reactions are rarely random, they're clues. They're the psyche tapping you on the shoulder, saying, look here, there's something unfinished. This is where irritation becomes a doorway. Someone dismisses you and you feel a heat rise in your chest. Someone talks over you and you want to explode. The old lens says, they're the problem. And sometimes, yes, they are behaving poorly. But the new lens asks something deeper. Why does this hit me so hard? What part of me still believes I have to earn respect? That's the moment you begin waking up. Because now you're not just reacting to the person in front of you, you're meeting the part of you that has been waiting to be seen. Imagine you're looking into a mirror with a crack running through it. If you don't notice the crack, every reflection looks distorted. You'll blame the faces, you'll blame the lighting, you'll spend your life convinced the world is warped. But once you finally see the crack, Everything changes. The distortion wasn't the world, it was the surface you were seeing the world through, and that's what happens when you stop blaming others. You see the crack in the mirror of your own psyche, not with shame, but with clarity. You stop obsessing over who's wrong and start understanding what needs healing. A man once shared that his biggest trigger in his relationship was feeling unheard. His partner would be on her phone, half listening, distracted, and it made him furious. He would accuse her of not caring. He would replay conversations in his head, building a case. He was close to ending the relationship because in his mind the story was simple. She doesn't listen. She doesn't value me. Then his life cracked open in a different way. Stress, inner collapse, a period where he couldn't outrun himself anymore. And in that silence, a brutal realization surfaced. What hurt him wasn't only her distraction. It was the fact that he had never truly listened to himself. He had been swallowing his own needs for years. He had been abandoning his own boundaries, then resenting other people for not honoring them. He had been waiting for someone else to give him the attention he refused to give his own inner life. When he saw that, his anger didn't dissolve because he became nicer. It dissolved because he stopped needing her to be the villain. He started hearing himself. And when you finally listen to yourself, you stop begging other people to do it for you. That's the alchemy Jung pointed to. You begin to see people as messengers, not monsters. The person who disappoints you reveals your expectations. The person who leaves you forces you to face what you were clinging to. The person who triggers you shines a light on where you're still raw. And strangely, once you see things this way, you argue less, you defend yourself less, you feel less compelled to prove, not because you're passive, because you're awake. You're no longer feeding the same old emotional loops. Now, let me be clear, this doesn't mean you tolerate disrespect. Sometimes the lesson is leave. Sometimes the healing is set a boundary. Sometimes the clarity is this person is not safe for me. But even then, you don't need blame to fuel your decision. You need truth. So here's your check-in. If you've ever felt blame dissolve into understanding, if you've ever had a moment where you stopped asking, why are they like this, and started asking, what is this awakening in me? Share one line in the comments, just one honest sentence. You never know who needs your mirror today. And once you stop needing someone to be the villain, pain begins to change its meaning. Sign number 3. You feel gratitude for the lesson. Hidden in pain. Not gratitude for suffering. Gratitude for what it forged, because there's a version of you that only exists because something didn't work out, because someone left, because a door slammed. And if you're still in the middle of the pain, this sign might sound impossible. When you're wounded, gratitude feels like an insult. It can feel like people are telling you to look on the bright side while you're drowning. That's not what we're doing here. This is something deeper. This is what happens after you've crossed a turning point inside. The question matures. It shifts from why me to what did this come to teach me? That shift doesn't come from willpower. It doesn't come from pretending you're okay. It arrives when your consciousness grows bigger than your pain, when you finally have enough distance to look back and see the pattern you couldn't see while you were living it. A breakup that once felt like the end of your world becomes the doorway to your strength. At the time, it's humiliating, it's destabilizing. You replay every conversation. You wonder what you did wrong. You bargain with the universe. You think the pain means you're being punished. But later, sometimes months, sometimes years, you realize something quietly shocking. If they had stayed, you would have stayed the same. You would have kept shrinking, kept tolerating, kept abandoning your intuition just to keep a connection alive. Their leaving didn't just hurt you, it forced you to meet yourself. It forced you to build a life that wasn't held together by someone else's presence. It forced you to become the kind of person who could stand on your own feet, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. And that's when gratitude becomes possible. Not gratitude that it happened. Gratitude that you didn't stay asleep. Jung would call this the alchemy of suffering, the way the psyche uses pain to push you toward wholeness. In Jungian terms, your life doesn't just happen. It unfolds with a hidden logic, not always fair, not always gentle, but often meaningful in ways we can't see until later. And this is why myth matters, because myths are the language of the unconscious. One of the clearest examples is the story of Joseph. Joseph is betrayed by his own brothers, sold, stripped of his place in the family, then falsely accused, then thrown into prison. If you look at it from the surface, it's just a chain of injustice, one disaster after another. The kind of story that would make anyone say, "Why me?" But the deeper truth is that every painful chapter is shaping him, not to break him, but to position him. Joseph's suffering becomes preparation. The betrayal forces him out of a smaller identity. The prison becomes training for leadership. The humiliation becomes the furnace that hardens him into wisdom. And when the moment comes, he ends up in a place where he can save others from famine, including the very people who harmed him. Now, you don't have to interpret your life through religion to understand the psychology. The point is this: when you pass the soul's test, you stop seeing your pain as random cruelty. You begin to see it as a reshaping. And that's where the Jung truth lands. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. That sentence is not motivational fluff. It's an identity shift. It's you realizing the past no longer owns you. It no longer gets to define your story. The wound becomes a chapter, not a name tag. And when you reinterpret your past from a higher vantage point, something miraculous happens. The pain loosens, not because you erase it, because you extract its meaning. You see that some people had to leave so you could finally see yourself clearly. Some dreams had to collapse because they weren't the dreams of your soul. And when you can honestly feel gratitude for the lesson, not the suffering, but the lesson, that's a sign your inner world has matured, that you are no longer living inside the injury. You are living inside the wisdom it produced. So if you've ever looked back at something that once shattered you and thought quietly, I wouldn't be who I am without that, that's sign 3. Because when meaning settles in, chaos loses its power to shake your center. The outside can surge, and something in you remains still. That's sign 4. And it's easy to miss because people assume calm means nothing happened to you. They assume if you're steady, your life must be easy. But Jungian maturity doesn't come from comfort. It comes from being broken open and realizing you can survive your own inner weather. Imagine your inner world is a lake. When you're not yet grounded, even a small breeze can shake the whole surface. A delayed text can trigger a spiral. A minor change of plans can feel like the universe turning against you. Your nervous system is always scanning, always bracing, always preparing for the next hit. But when you've passed the painful test of the soul, something settles deeper than the surface. Storms still come, waves still rise, but the depth stays quiet. The waves belong to the surface, peace belongs to the depths, and you start living from that depth. This doesn't mean you don't feel stress anymore. It means stress doesn't drive the car. You notice the emotion, but you don't become it. You move through chaos without losing yourself inside it. This is where the neuroscience piece matters, but keep it simple. When you live for years in stress, your brain gets trained to fire fast. Your system learns react first, think later. That's survival. That's the amygdala doing its job, detecting threat and sounding the alarm. But when you do deep inner work, when you've had to sit with your feelings instead of running from them, your reactivity softens. The observing part of you gets stronger, the part that can pause, assess, choose. So your body learns something new. This is intense, but it's not the end. And that changes everything, because now, even when life is chaotic, you're not trying to control everything just to feel safe. Safety starts coming from within, from the relationship you've built with yourself, from the quiet confidence that you can survive discomfort without abandoning who you are. That's why this sign feels like a still point. It's not the absence of problems, it's the presence of grounding. It's the moment you realize I can stay here, I don't have to flee myself. So let me ask you something. Have you felt that inner anchor, that place inside you that doesn't shake the way it used to, even when the outside is loud? If you have, comment one word, still. Not to show off, not to prove anything, just as a small signal to yourself that you've changed. Because when you find that still point, you don't just survive storms, you stop being owned by them. And here's the surprise. After deep pain, some hearts don't close. You don't rescue, you understand. That's sign 5. Your compassion deepens instead of hardening. And honestly, this is one of the rarest outcomes of pain, because most people, after enough disappointment, go the other direction. They build armor, they become suspicious of everyone. They keep their heart behind a wall and call it being smart. And sometimes that armor makes sense. If you've been used, lied to, or emotionally drained, your system learns don't open. It's not safe. But when you've truly passed the hardest test of the soul, something surprising happens. You don't close. You soften with awareness. Not the softness of being easily manipulated, not the softness of pretending everything is fine. A different kind of softness, the kind that comes from seeing the human condition clearly and still choosing not to become cruel. Jung spent his life pointing toward this. He understood that suffering doesn't automatically make you wise. Suffering can make you bitter. It can make you cynical. It can make you small. The transformation happens when you metabolize pain into insight, when you let it deepen you instead of harden you. And you can feel it when this sign arrives. You start seeing people more accurately. Someone acts controlling, and you can sense the fear driving it. Someone becomes cold, and you realize it's not strength, it's protection. But here's the key. You don't use this understanding as an excuse to keep tolerating harm. You understand, and you choose. You might listen, but you don't become someone's emotional dumping ground. You might forgive, but you don't forget what your nervous system learned. This is compassion with boundaries, warmth with discernment. And ironically, it often makes you more powerful because you're no longer reacting from rawness. You're responding from clarity. A quick example. There's a woman I'll call Elena, a public figure, visible, admired, and quietly scarred by years of pain most people never saw. In her early years, she went through heavy darkness, family fractures, instability, the kind of emotional weather that can either freeze a heart or forge it. And later, when she had every reason to become guarded, she chose the opposite. She didn't turn her pain into a personality. She turned it into a bridge. She began showing up where suffering lived, in places most people scroll past. She used her platform to draw attention to forgotten lives. Not to be seen as a savior, but because something in her recognized the eyes of others, because she had been there in her own way. That's what mature compassion does. It doesn't need to rescue everyone. It simply refuses to look away. And Jung captured this with one of his most haunting lines. The purpose is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being, not a spotlight, not a performance, a steady flame. This sign shows up in everyday life too. You stop judging people so quickly, not because you lack standards, but because you understand complexity. You stop needing to win arguments because you can see what's really being fought for: safety, validation, control, belonging. You become gentler, but you also become harder to manipulate, because your compassion is no longer driven by guilt. It's driven by truth. You offer what is real, and you release what is not. That's why this sign is a milestone. It means you're no longer using love as a survival strategy. You're using love as a conscious choice. And when compassion deepens like this, it changes what you attract. Shallow connections start feeling exhausting. Drama starts feeling loud. People who feed on chaos feel uncomfortable around you because you're not feeding it back. Meanwhile, the right people, mature people, feel safe in your presence, not because you save them, but because you don't punish them for being human. So if you've noticed, you're softer now, but also clearer. That's not weakness. That's what it looks like when the heart reopens with wisdom. And once the heart reopens with wisdom, you stop demanding certainty. You stop chasing guarantees. You start following alignment. That's sign 6. You can live with uncertainty and still trust. And if you've spent most of your life needing answers, needing clarity, needing closure, needing a plan, this one can feel almost impossible at first, because uncertainty used to trigger your survival system. It used to feel like danger, like you were standing on a floor that could vanish at any second. So you tried to control. You overthought everything. You clung to what was familiar, even when it was shrinking you, because at least it was predictable. But after you pass the soul's hardest test, something changes, not because life becomes clearer, because you stop demanding clarity from life in order to move forward. You learn to walk without needing the entire road lit up. Imagine you're on a ship at night, when you're still trapped in fear. You want full visibility. You want to see the shore, the waves, the weather, the exact route, the exact arrival time. And if you can't see it, you panic. You assume you're lost. But a ship doesn't need the sun to stay on course. It needs a compass. And in Jungian terms, that compass is intuition. Not intuition as a dramatic, psychic moment. Intuition as the quiet, embodied knowing that lies beneath your thoughts. The subtle pull toward one direction and the subtle heaviness that appears when something is misaligned. This is what changes at sign 6. You stop chasing certainty in the external world because you discover something more stable inside you. You start listening differently. You pay attention to what expands your chest and what tightens it. You notice how your energy feels after you say yes. You start trusting the signals you use to dismiss. And at first, it can feel scary because you're not used to being guided from within. You were taught to be guided by expectations, by approval, by what looks good on paper. But then life starts responding to this new relationship you have with yourself. Not always instantly, not always dramatically. Sometimes it's so subtle you could miss it if you weren't paying attention. A conversation you almost didn't have. A book that lands in your hands at the exact moment you needed it. A pattern repeating until you finally see what it's trying to show you. Jung called this synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, a kind of psychological alignment where your inner world and outer world begin speaking the same language. And here's a real-life example that captures it. Someone loses their job unexpectedly, no warning. One day they have routine, structure, identity. The next day it's gone, and at first, it's pure panic, because the mind interprets job loss as more than income. It interprets it as safety collapsing. So they do what they've always done, scramble, apply everywhere, force a new plan immediately, fill the silence with frantic motion, but something in them, this new version of them, chooses a different response. They pause, not because they're lazy, because they can feel that running would be another form of fear. They take a few days, they walk, they write, they let themselves breathe, long enough to hear what they actually want, not what they think they should want. And in that space, something opens. An old friend reaches out of nowhere. A collaboration offer appears. A side interest that used to feel impractical suddenly becomes a real path. They find themselves in a field they never would have chosen from their old identity. And it fits, like it was waiting for them. Later they look back and realize, if the old structure hadn't collapsed, they would have stayed asleep inside it. The uncertainty wasn't punishment, it was redirection. And this is the heart of sign 6. You begin to trust the unseen, not blindly, not in denial, but with a grounded sense that life can unfold without you strangling it for answers. You stop trying to control every outcome so you can finally feel safe, because you learn safety is an inner relationship, not a perfect external situation. You start moving by resonance. You choose what's true even when it's not guaranteed. You follow what's aligned even when it's not applauded. You step into the next chapter not because you have certainty, but because you have clarity about what no longer fits. So if you've been in an uncertain season lately, if you've been standing in the dark without a map, this may be your sign. You're not lost. You're being guided differently now. And if you've ever seen signs show up right on time, small, strange confirmations that felt almost too perfect, tap like, just as a quiet acknowledgement. Not for the algorithm, for your own nervous system, for the part of you that's learning to trust. Because once you can live with uncertainty and still trust, the final shift arrives. And sign 7 is the deepest one because it isn't a mood shift, it's an identity shift. It's when your story stops being the wound and becomes the wisdom. Jung would say, this is what happens when the psyche finally stops orbiting the trauma like it's the sun. In the beginning, that orbit is normal. Pain becomes the center of gravity. Your mind needs a reason, something to explain why your world changed. So the wound quietly becomes your personality. You carried it in your posture, in your reactions, in the way you braced for disappointment before it even arrived. The wound became the lens you saw life through. But after enough inner work, after enough nights where you had to sit with yourself instead of escaping, you start to experience something Jung called integration. The wound doesn't disappear, it loses its authority. Imagine a piece of driftwood gets dragged through storms, slammed against rocks, scraped raw by the current. If you watched it mid-journey, you'd call it damage. But if you find it later on the shore, it's been shaped, not prettier in a fake way, more real, smoothed down where it used to be sharp, marked in a way that tells the truth. That's what happens when your pain stops being your identity. The impacts didn't ruin you, they carved away the parts that were never you to begin with. Let me make this concrete. A woman named Maya went through a divorce at 34. From the outside, it looked clean, papers signed, shared friends, stayed neutral, people said the usual lines, everything happens for a reason. But inside, her nervous system was in free fall, because she wasn't just losing a partner, she was losing the role that kept her feeling safe, the fixer, the one who could keep love alive by working harder than anyone else. And that's what shattered her at first, the realization that effort isn't intimacy. Overfunctioning isn't devotion. Sacrificing yourself isn't what makes someone stay. Jung would call this the collapse of a persona. Maya's good wife identity wasn't just a preference, it was a strategy. if she was agreeable enough, patient enough, understanding enough, she believed she could prevent abandonment. So when the marriage ended, the wound tried to write the whole meaning of her life. See, you weren't enough. But the deeper work began when she stopped asking, "How do I get over him?" and started asking, "What part of me did I abandon to keep him?" That's the pivot from wound to wisdom. She began noticing patterns she never wanted to admit, how she minimized her needs, how she rationalized disrespect, how she stayed loyal to potential instead of reality. Not with self-hate, with clarity. And then something unexpected happened. She stopped feeling ashamed of her past self. She started feeling protective of her. Because when you really mature, you don't look back and mock the version of you that was starving for love. You recognize what that version was doing, trying to survive with the tools she had. Jung would say that compassion is the moment consciousness stops splitting you into good parts and bad parts. You become whole enough to hold your own story gently, and that's when quiet joy appears. Maya described it as, "I'm okay in my own presence now." A kind of joy that doesn't depend on your life being perfect. It lives in small moments that the old you would have rushed past. A calm morning, clean sheets, a deep breath, the feeling of being okay in your own skin. It's the joy of someone who has stopped fighting their own existence. That's what Jung meant by individuation, becoming a kind of light, not loud, not attention-seeking, just real. So if you've reached the point where you can say, honestly, that didn't break me, it woke me, then you've crossed the deepest threshold. You're no longer living as the wounded one, you're living as the awakened one, and that's not just healing, that's a homecoming. These signs aren't loud milestones, they're quiet proof you've crossed a threshold. No one threw you a celebration when you stopped spiraling. No one handed you a certificate when you learned to sit in silence without running. But you can feel it in the way certain things don't own you anymore. In the way you recover faster. In the way you choose peace without explaining yourself. And here's the part I hope you don't miss. You didn't become someone else. You returned to yourself. The version of you that's calmer, clearer, less available for chaos. That's not a new personality. That's you without the survival mask. You after the storm. You with the lessons integrated. So if this video found you in your own long night, let it be a reminder you are not behind. You are not broken. You are becoming. And if there's someone in your life who's walking through that same darkness right now, send this to them. Sometimes the right words at the right moment can keep a soul from giving up. If you want more Jungian depth, healing, shadow work, and real inner change, hit subscribe, and we'll keep walking this path together.